colonel warning us about what we would encounter and using the most deeply unpleasant language about Palestinians, that really shocked me, actually. It sounds naive.
Many decent people are absolutely horrified by what Israel's military is doing to the Palestinians in Gaza. But when they express that criticism, however reasonably phrased, they find themselves being accused of anti-Semitism when they've said nothing of the sort. Joining me today to discuss this issue is Tony Lerman, who's just written an article for Declassified about this issue. Tony, great to have you with us today.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here.
Now, Tony, for people who aren't familiar with your background, you were chief executive of the Rothschilds Foundation, a founding editor of Anti-Semitism World Report, director of two think tanks, the Institute of Jewish Affairs and the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. And you've gone on a journey to becoming an anti-Zionist Jew. But before all that, can you tell us about how your relationship with Zionism started?
Although I grew up in quite an Orthodox Jewish family, went to synagogue often, and that was very much part of my life when I was young. At the age of 8, I went to my first Zionist youth camp, and this was because my mother, when she was young, in the early 20s, went herself as a young Jew to one of the early meetings of a Zionist youth movement called Habonim. And although that was just something which was a kind of one-off for her, she and my father felt that we needed something other than just the Orthodox Jewish education. So I was 8 years old. I knew nothing about Zionism at all. It's only years later, really, that I understood exactly what it was that we were doing there, which was acting like soldiers, and it was camping and going on marches and all that sort of stuff. So really it begins from there. But I didn't actually engage properly with Zionism until I was 13, when I formally started going along to the meetings of the Zionist youth movement, Zionist Socialist Youth Movement, as it was called.
As you became a teenager, it was particularly the socialist Zionism, left-wing Zionism, and the kibbutz movement that resonated with you.
Yes, indeed. It was actually the socialism in those early years, from sort of 13 to 16, 17, 18, that were really, for me, I suppose, more important than Zionism, in the sense in which we took the Zionism, or I took the Zionism for granted. The whole Zionist story about returning to the land, and this was the destiny for Jews, and there was no future for Jews in the diaspora, and so on and so forth. Indeed, even when I then went to live in Israel after heading the Zionist youth movement, I was the general secretary of the Zionist youth movement when I was about 21 or whenever it was. I was still really concerned mostly with socialism and with the idea of living on a kibbutz and practicing the kind of socialism that was supposed to be so successful. That's the way it was saw at the time. In the youth movement, we hardly learned anything at all, by the way, about Palestinians. A Palestinian, actually, we were led to sort of understand, was in the 20s and 30s, for example, a Jewish person from the UK who was a Zionist and was going to live in Palestine. And because it was Mandate Palestine, they had a Palestinian passport. So that was the first thing that we heard about as far as the word Palestinian was concerned. Who were the other inhabitants? They were Arabs, sort of this kind of blanket term for everybody else. So there was no real understanding of who was there. And the only sense we began to get as the years went by and as we got older was about the conflict, and about, because this was the time when the Palestinian national movement was beginning to develop, and raids across the border and skirmishes and all that kind of thing. So we had this idea of this shadowy, the shadowy Arabs who were coming into the Jewish homeland, and so on and so forth. So it's not as if in the Zionist movement we at that time were given this notion of Palestinians as somehow sort of evil. We just didn't have a conception at all of what.
They just didn't come into it at all. Yeah. No. I guess in the early 60s, when you first went out to live on a kibbutz, you were living in land that Palestinians might have been expelled from during the Nakba, and kibbutzes have been formed in that area.
Yes, indeed. I had no knowledge of this at the time. We did know that this kibbutz where I was living at, it was called Amiad. It was in the north of Israel, not far from the Sea of Galilee. That it was actually a site of archaeological interest because it was rumored to be the place where Joseph, of the coat of many colors, was sort of not buried but put into a pit, and I think the village was called Jib Yusuf, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So we knew that had some Arab connection, but it was only later, when I was already back in England after having lived on the kibbutz for a couple of years and having done national service, that I began to sort of investigate and ask the question, well, hold on a minute, what was this place? And discovered that indeed it was part of the ethnic cleansing. But this was never ever mentioned in the 2 years that I was living there, and in the previous time in 1964 when I was living there for about 3 or 4 months. It was only something I discovered after I had come back to the UK, feeling disillusioned with what I understood to be this wonderful socialist society. It seemed to me not at all so wonderful. Particularly women were treated as second-class citizens. And it was, after all, socialism for one people. It wasn't socialism for anyone else.
Was another formative experience for you during your national service in the Israeli army, where you went on a march one night to Hebron, which is a Palestinian town in the West Bank?
Yes, indeed. That came actually towards the end of the service that I did. I was actually only in the army for 3 months because, as an immigrant, and I was married with a child, you only had to do the minimum, which was 3 months. So this came at the end of this course. The course that I was on was laying mines, was learning how to lay mines, engineering. It was the engineering corps, it was called. And yes, towards the end of that, we went on this route march, and that was the first time I had really encountered sort of naked racism on the part of our officers. Our officers mostly were simply, engaged in knocking us into shape, running and standing still and jumping and throwing, learning how to throw grenades and firing guns and so on and so forth. But before this march, we were given this talk by, I think it was the colonel who was head of the whole group, warning us about what we would encounter, and using the most deeply unpleasant language about Palestinians, and that really shocked me. Actually, it sounds naive, but I hadn't actually encountered that before, and it really affected my whole perspective. Where I did my army service, that was in the occupied territories. It was at a place called Gush Etzion, which I didn't know at the time, but that was at the heart of the settler movement. When I look back on that and how close I was to this movement that has come to actually dominate and take over, in effect, Israeli society and the government and so on and so forth. It's quite something to assimilate.
And is it right to say that from the early days of socialist Zionism, which was quite a strong current in Israeli society, that's kind of been replaced over the years by more right-wing Zionism, religious Zionism, and the kind of religiously motivated settler movement in the West Bank? We see now in Netanyahu's government, there are figures in the coalition like Itamar Ben-Gvir from the Jewish Power Party. Is it fair to say that within Zionism itself, there has been a shift over the years to get to where we are now? And do you think there were always kind of indications that it might go in that direction?
I think there were always indications that it might go in that direction, and some people always warned about it, but that wasn't the consensus view. I think there was a strong feeling, because the socialist and liberal element within Zionism was the one that